Amen. So glad you're here today. We're going through a series, a 4-week series entitled Grudges. And I'm just so glad that for all 4 weeks we get to look at that cat. I just love that cat. Can you relate to that cat? I think most of us can. We've probably all had that look on our face a number of times through life. If you can relate to the cat, I want to ask you if you can relate to the 4 topics that we're going to be looking at. Here they are. The first one was last week, when someone is upset with you. Next, when someone does you wrong. Third, when you don't forgive. And finally, when you forgive but can't forget. Now, Jesus speaks to us about what to do in any of these 4, but I am sure that every single one of us in this room struggles with all 4 of those at one time or another. Today we're going to zero in on the second one, which is, let's put it by itself, when someone does you wrong. Now, I know that you need this, and I know that you and I need this as long as we live, because as long as you live, there are going to be people that do you wrong. At home, at work, at school, at church, because you and I live among sinful people, and you and I are 2 of them. We're doing people wrong. They're doing us wrong. What do? We need to know what to do when someone does us wrong. And Jesus has given us the most practical help here. We can all do what he's going to tell us to do in the passage we're going to look at today. Here's the heart of what he wants to tell you right here in Matthew 18:15. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you've gained your brother. Now, the word brother is used in the first line and the last line of this verse, and I think it's important we know who's he talking about here. Well, certainly he has in mind a Christian brother, someone that's believed in Jesus for everlasting life, as you have. I hope you have a Christian brother. But I believe, and I'm going to show you a verse in a moment, where we could say, well, what we read here about a Christian brother, this truth applies to anyone, whether it's somebody in the church, or it could be somebody in your home, it could be somebody at school, somebody at work. I believe that this verse certainly begins by thinking about a Christian brother, but I think it applies to anyone you know that's done you wrong. And I'm going to show you a verse in a moment where I support that. Now, what should you do when your brother sins against you, when somebody does you wrong? Here it is, these next 2 lines. Go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. In my opinion, only God knows how much this happens, but in my opinion, this is one of the most neglected, ignored, disobeyed statements that Jesus ever made. Because it seems to me that in the world in which we live, most people don't do what Jesus said to do. They hold a grudge. They just stay mad. They don't go to the person and talk about it. Or they tell somebody else. Let me tell you what he did to me. In fact, I got a group of you. Let me tell the group what he did to me. This goes on all the time. Jesus is telling us something very different, something very clear, something very straightforward, that if your brother sins against you, you go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Now, this is an important truth that demands other insights to give us a better understanding of what Jesus meant. I'm going to show you some passages from Scripture that relate to this. And I think these passages are very helpful to tell us what this means and what it looks like and what it doesn't look like from the Scriptures I'm going to share with you now. Starting with Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. This is earlier in the same book, Gospel of Matthew. Here's what Jesus said. Whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them. Do you want what you want people, you should do to others what you want them to do to you, okay? So, if someone has something against you, do you want them to come and talk to you about it? Or would you prefer that they just hold a grudge? I think you'd rather have them come and talk to you about it. How about this? If someone thinks that you've sinned against them, do you want them to go and tell everybody else what you did? Or what they say you did? Or tell a group what you did? I don't think so. Nobody wants that. We would prefer that they come and talk to me. I want them to come talk to me. Don't go telling everybody else about your gripe against me. Come and talk to me. I'm pretty sure everybody here would agree with that. Now, notice who he's talking about here. Men. He's not talking about a brother. He's talking about whoever it might be in the world. General statement of believer, unbeliever, in the church or not in the church, family member, somebody at work, somebody at school. That's why I say, when it comes to going to someone that's done you wrong, you would want them to do that to you. You should do that to them, whether it's a Christian brother or not. But he especially has a Christian brother in mind. But it doesn't stop there. All right, here's another passage that relates to what Jesus is telling us. Again, in Matthew chapter 7, earlier in the book, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Now, the plank and the speck are metaphors for sin, okay? You believe that this person has done you wrong. They've got a speck in their eye. You want to remove the speck. You want to go talk to them about what they've done you wrong or how they've done you wrong. What should you do first? First, remove the plank from your own eye. Make sure that you have dealt with what you may have done wrong. Now, why would it be a plank in your eye and a speck in their eye? Because your sin should be more important to you than their sin. It should be more important to you that you search your own heart and pray like David prayed, Lord, search me and know my heart. Show me my anxious thought. Show me if there's any wicked way in me before I go talk to him about what he's done wrong. This is very important. That before you go to someone and talk about what this person has done to you, that you search your own heart before God and think, is there anything that I have done? And when you go to the brother, you say, first, I've come to see this is what I've done wrong, and get that settled, and then talk to them about what you feel they have done wrong. Now, you can't make stuff up here. It may be that you've searched your heart. You can't think of anything you've done wrong, so fine. Go talk to them about the speck in their eye. Now, notice the reference, Matthew 7:5. I point that out because the verse I'm going to share with you next is the very next verse, Matthew 7:6. We can't divorce 5 from 6 because here's what he says in 6. Next verse, there we go. Do not give what is holy to the dogs, and do not cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Now, Jesus is speaking metaphorically here, using dogs and pigs as an illustration of people. He's not talking about four-legged dogs and four-legged pigs. He's talking about two-legged dogs and two-legged pigs, which would be people. Okay? And some people, Jesus is saying, it's pretty strong language here. Some people are like dogs, they're like pigs, because you try to help them. That's what the pearls are. You come to them with pearls, and in this case, it would be what we read in the previous verse. You're trying to come and help them see the sin in their lives. You're trying to help them get the speck out of their eye. After you've first gotten the log out of your own eye, you're trying to help them get the speck out of their eye. Those are pearls. That should be valuable to this person, that you came to help them see the sin that you're concerned about. And there are some people in this world that will get mad at you. They will trample on what you're trying to tell them. They will turn and tear you to pieces with their words. And Jesus is saying, here, look, don't miss these words. Do not give what is holy to the dogs or cast your pearls before swine. Don't put up with abuse that you've already experienced. Now, the only way you could know if they're a dog or a swine is if you'd experienced this previously. Don't use this as an excuse and say, I think they might get mad at me. Jesus won't accept that. You would have had to come to a conclusion from previous experience that that's the kind of person this is, because I've tried this before. And what Jesus is saying, if you've tried it before and you got mistreated for trying to help them with what they've done wrong, do not go back and put up with that abuse. And that's important. That's a disclaimer on what he tells us about what to do when someone does you wrong. Now, if you go to them to try to talk to them about what they've done against you that is wrong, their sin against you, this next verse is so important. Here it is, John 7:24, words of Jesus. He said, do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. This is so important. You think that somebody has sinned against you. It appears to you that they've done something against you that is wrong. They've said something about you. They've done something to you. And from your point of view, it appears that they've sinned against you. But Jesus says, be careful about judging based on what appears to be. You need to judge with righteous judgment. You need to judge rightly, not according to just what appears to be. So how can you judge rightly that they've done you wrong? How can you feel for sure, know for sure that really this really was a sin against you? How can you judge with righteous judgment? Well, there's a verse in Proverbs that I like that I think really explains this. Here's the verse in Proverbs 18:13. He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. Wow. He who answers a matter before he hears it, it's folly and a shame to him. Meaning, if you haven't listened, if you haven't heard what the other person has to say about this, if you haven't talked to them where they can tell you their side of it, where they can explain to you from their point of view, but you just go in and you've got the answer and you haven't even listened to what they say, that's foolish and shameful to be like that. So what would it sound like? What would it look like to follow that verse? It would mean something like this. You believe that this person sinned against you, and you go to them, as Jesus said to do, go to them and talk about it. But really the first thing you should say, in my opinion, based on this verse is, it appears to me that you've done me wrong, but I want to make sure I understand the facts. I want to make sure I know the facts. I've heard that you said this. It appears that you did this. Would you agree with me that you said this? Would you agree with me that you did this? Help me to understand, from your point of view, what happened. And if then they talk about it and they say, yeah, I did that, or yeah, I said that, I think another question, well, why did you do that? Why did you say that? What were you thinking? What was on your mind when you did that? Now, there's no one way to say it, but can you hear me talking right now? What I'm saying is, hear what they have to say. Try to draw out of them what's on their mind before you tell them more of what's on yours. There's a real simple verse. We looked at it last week in relation when somebody has something against you. We're going to look at it again today, and the question is when someone does you wrong. And here's I love this verse. It applies so much to these situations. James 1:19, be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. By the way, you've got that memorized. You don't even have to try. If you walk out of here today, what was that verse? Remember about swift to hear? Yeah, swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. That's one you can carry with you for as long as you live. Listen, what that looks like, sounds like, when you go to somebody that sinned against you, somebody that's done you wrong, just remember, be quick to hear. Listen to what they have to say about what you're bringing to them. Be slow to speak. Listen to them. Don't interrupt them. Don't say, yeah, but. Hear them out. And definitely be slow to anger, because anger does not achieve the righteousness of God in any of these circumstances. All right, so we've looked at some verses, I think, that help us to better understand what Jesus had in mind when he said, as we go back to the main command here, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. And then notice the last two lines. If he hears you, you've gained your brother. He sinned against you and things weren't right between you and him, but you went to him and you told him what you felt he had done to you. Hopefully he'll hear you. And hopefully if he hears you, that means he'll apologize. He'll say, yeah, you got a point. I did do wrong. Please forgive me. If he was here last week, he'd know to say, what? We rehearsed it last week. Help me here. Thank you. What was it? I was wrong. Don't hold your breath on that, because most people don't know how to say it. I was wrong. In fact, I think let's rehearse that again. What is it you need to say? Oh, you're good. You're good. But let's suppose he doesn't notice I was wrong. He just says, I'm sorry. Take it. Accept it as an apology. And now you're good. You've gained your brother. Things are good between you and your brother. Now I want you to notice this word, if. Oh, that's an important word here. If he hears you, you've gained your brother. What Jesus is telling us obviously is he might not hear you. He might not agree with you. He might not apologize to you. And you still got a problem because you haven't gained your brother. He hasn't apologized and made it right. So what should you do? Well, Jesus anticipates that this could happen with the word if. That's why he didn't quit here. He says, this is only step one. Hopefully step one will work, but if step one doesn't work, here's step two. If he doesn't listen to you, here it is in the next verse. If he will not hear, take with you one or two more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word may be established. Doesn't listen to you? You tried? Now what do? You go get 1 or 2 people to come with you and talk to him again. These are called witnesses. What do they witness? They witness every word. Now, they surely didn't witness the sin against you. That would be odd that they saw what he did to you. It's that they're witnessing every word that you say in contrast to what the other person says. And they witness the conversation that you now have between this person. You had it previously and you didn't get anywhere. Now they're going to witness the conversation that every word may be established. That means they're going to decide what's true and what isn't true, who's right and who's wrong. By the way, Jesus is doing some math here, and I think we ought to do the math with him, okay? So it starts with you, and one or two more. So that would equal you plus 1 equals 2, you plus 2 equals 3. Get it? So that's why you've got 2 or 3 witnesses. You knew that already, but I just wanted to have fun spelling it out, that Jesus did some math here to help us to think this through specifically. You take 1 or 2 witnesses, they listen to the conversation. It's their job to decide who's right, who's wrong, what's true, what's not true. Hopefully, he will listen to the witnesses, and he will finally admit that he sinned against you and what he did was wrong, and there will be fellowship between you and him again. So let's review what we've seen. Jesus gave us 2 steps. When someone does you wrong, what should you do? Number 1, go to him. If he doesn't listen, go to step 2. Take 1 or 2 witnesses with you. But what if he doesn't listen to them? Jesus anticipates this. He might not listen to you or the witnesses. What do you do then? Here's step 3. Take it to the church. Oh, take it to what? Take it to the church? Is that your idea, Bob? No, I'd never come up with that idea. That's Jesus' idea. The reason I put that there is because that's what he says in the next verse. If he refuses to hear them, there it is. Tell it to the church. So what would that look like? Okay, you went to him, he didn't listen to you. You took 2 witnesses, he didn't listen to them. So next Sunday morning, you come to the church and you're sitting over here and you stand up during my sermon. You say, I got something to say to the church. John Doe over here, there he is right there. He stole $100 from me and won't pay it back and won't admit that he did it. And I want the whole church to know it. How would you like that? What would church be like if that's what he meant? I mean, we've got visitors here. What are the visitors going to think about that? They will never come back, I guarantee. I wouldn't go back. I wouldn't go back to a church like that. Are you kidding me? What is Jesus talking about? If he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. Well, he didn't mean the little story I just told you, for sure. We need more information on this. Jesus is, when he taught this in Matthew 18, Matthew only recorded just the bones. There's more flesh that needs to be added. There's more information that needs to be added, and it is added later in the New Testament as to what it means to tell it to the church. And if you go on to the New Testament, you would see, well, certainly this means go to the leaders of the church. Go to the elders of the church and appeal to the elders to get involved to try to settle this issue. And hopefully he'll listen to the elders. But if he doesn't listen to the elders are told they may need to take it to the church. And as I already explained to you, that wouldn't be good on Sunday morning. What we learn later in the New Testament, that this is something that would happen at the Lord's Supper. And that's the place to deal with it for a number of reasons. But what if it went that far? What if it went that far and he still didn't listen to the elders, he still doesn't listen to the church, then what? Well, Jesus tells us. But if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. Now there's more information again in the New Testament tells us what Jesus had in mind. What all he's saying here is don't have fellowship with him. And you can read about that in the New Testament. In fact, 1 Corinthians 5 talks about that. You should not fellowship with him. You shouldn't eat with him. It doesn't mean you can't talk to him. It means you don't eat with him. You don't have fellowship with him because things aren't right. And the reason for that, we're told, is to get his attention. Nothing will get his attention. The church needs to help him to see this is serious, that you won't apologize for what you did wrong. And that's what Jesus has in mind here. So here are the 3 steps. Go to him. If he doesn't listen, take 1 or 2 witnesses. If he won't listen to them, tell it to the church, which start with the church leaders, the elders of the church. Okay, now I want to quickly say, please listen to what I have to say. This is important that you really hear what I'm saying about these 3 steps. I've been in ministry here at Cypress Valley for 48 years. And in 48 years, I've seen this in action many, many, many times. Where somebody sins against a person, that person goes and talks to him about it. And I want to tell you, I have seen God work through this first step time and again, countless times. God stands behind this truth that when you do what Jesus said in step 1, most of the time that person will respond because they're thankful that somebody came and talked to them instead of going and talking to somebody else. And I've seen it. I've seen it over and over again. Step 1 works almost every time. You notice I said almost. But virtually every time step 1 works. In 48 years, I've seen step 2 in action just a few times. Very, very rare. That's saying a lot in 48 years to say we only had to go to, I've only seen step 2, I could count it on less than one hand, the number of times I've seen that it had to go to step 2. Now, here's what I want to say. Never, up until this point, never have I seen it go to step 3. And I pray that I never will. I hope it never happens. It could happen. I just hope and pray that it never does. So what's my point that in telling you about my experience with these 3 steps? Here's my point, and you should take this to heart. Step 1 is a very powerful step. God will honor step 1. If you honor God by following step 1, somebody sins against you and you go and talk to them, God has his hand on you when you do that. And most of the time, God's going to work through that to accomplish great things. However, sometimes step 2 is necessary, and Jesus is aware of that. Sometimes step 2, take 1 or 2 witnesses, is necessary, but Jesus knows that you and I aren't very comfortable. It was hard enough to do step 1. Step 2, are you kidding me? I need to take 1 or 2 more? That sounds hard. I'm a little fearful of that. Jesus knows that. He knows that you're not comfortable with that. He knows that I'm not comfortable with that. I don't want to do that. Okay, but that's what he said to do. So what he does, he makes you a promise that if you have to go to step 2, he's going to be with you. Here's how he says it. I've got 3 verses to read, and then I'm going to go back through them and look more carefully at what he says in these next 3 verses. Here they are. Surely I say to you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you that if 2 of you agree on earth concerning anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them. Now, this verse has been totally lifted out of context in so many circles today, as if Jesus didn't say anything before it, which he did. But this verse is lifted out of context where people say, oh, that verse means that whenever 2 or 3 are gathered together to pray, he's in the midst of us. Well, that may be true, but that's not what he's talking about. What 2 or 3 has he just been talking about? You know the answer, the 2 or 3 witnesses. That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about 2 or 3 that gather to pray. He's talking about 2 or 3 that are trying to witness a conflict between 2 brothers. and they're gathered in my name. Meaning, when you call one or two witnesses, you're doing it in Jesus' name. That means you're doing what Jesus told you to do. You're doing what he wants you to do. And he'll be there in the midst. So if you call one or two witnesses, Jesus says, you've got my word on it. I'm there with you. I'm involved. I'll be there to be involved in what takes place in this meeting with the two or three witnesses. With that as a background, in fact, that's the third verse, we can better understand the two verses before it. So let's go back to verse 18. Surely I say to you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, this verse has been lifted totally out of context in many circles to say, whatever I bind, whatever I loose, God's going to stand with me. No, that's not what it's talking about. He's talking about two or three witnesses that make a judgment, if I could use that word, a determination in this scenario of what's true and what's not true, who's right and who's wrong. And they may say, this is binding. He did sin against you. Or they may loose it and they say, no, you're wrong. He didn't sin against you because we've heard the evidence. What Jesus is saying, heaven stands behind the two or three witnesses. Heaven stands behind what you bind and what you loose in this situation about when a brother says another brother has done them wrong. And that also is important in the next verse where he says, I say to you, if two of you agree on earth concerning anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. Another verse that's been totally lifted out of context and totally abused, and I'm going to use that word, abused by many, to say, man, two of us agree that God should heal you of cancer. And he made a promise that if two of us agree that he should heal of you of cancer, then he's going to heal you of cancer. That's the promise in Matthew 18:19. What an abuse of what Jesus said. That is not what he was talking about. He's talking about, again, where two of you agree. Two what? Two witnesses. The two witnesses that were called in to get involved in this thing. You two witnesses, if you ask anything, if concerning anything that they ask, it will be done. What in the world would these two witnesses be asking God for in this situation? Well, I can tell you, because I've been in this situation. I was called to be a witness in a dispute between two people in the church. And I was called along with another elder to get involved in it. Let me tell you something. We prayed hard. For one thing, wisdom. Oh, Lord, do we need wisdom? Now, that was first, but also grace and love and understanding. There were a lot of things that we prayed for, but number one was wisdom. Lord, we need wisdom to be able to sort out what this is about. And by the way, God answered our prayer, and he gave us wisdom, and the situation was resolved. But that's what Jesus is talking about here, is the two witnesses praying for what they need in this particular situation. And that's all a background for the next verse that we looked at earlier, but I'm going to read it again. Here it is. Where two or three of you are gathered in my name, I'm there in the midst. If you got to go to the step 2, I'm going to be with you in step 2. All right, so Jesus is telling all this to the disciples, his 12 disciples, as I'm repeating it to you here this morning. And one of the disciples there was named Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends and followers. And Peter's listening to what Jesus said about, going to your brother and talking to him about what he's done wrong. But Peter's got another issue that he's wrestling with, just a whole nother issue. And so he brings it up to Jesus in response to what Jesus said. Peter came to him and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Lord, I heard what you said about going to him, but I got another issue. How often am I supposed to put up with this? How often am I supposed to forgive him? And I think Peter had somebody in mind, by the way. Can't imagine he would have brought it up if he wasn't struggling with this. How many times can I forgive? 3, 4, 5, how about 7? Even 7 times, Lord? Even 7 times? Should I forgive him 7 times? And Jesus gives him an answer. He says, I don't say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. That's 490. And if you think Jesus meant 490, okay, I'm at 488, 489, 490, done. No, obviously, he's speaking figuratively. There's no limit. Forgive him as many times as it takes till you die. And I'm sure that was kind of a take-back moment for Peter. And then Jesus goes on to tell Peter, I need to tell you how important this is. I'm going to tell you a story about what happens if you don't forgive. In fact, here's the topic that he goes on to tell him. When you don't forgive. Peter, let me tell you what happens when you don't forgive. And that's the following story in Matthew 18 that we're going to look at next week. Because the topic next week is when you don't forgive. What happens when you don't forgive? We're going to look at, well, what does it mean to forgive? And what does it mean, what's going to happen when you don't forgive? You don't want to miss. Next week is very, very, very important for your life. Because you struggle with forgiving people just like I do. It's sometimes very hard to forgive, and we need God's help to know, well, what happens when I don't? So don't miss next week. But the topic today was when someone does you wrong. And the bottom line of the message is the bottom line of what Jesus tells us. Here's what he tells us. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you've gained your brother. Now, please come back next week. We're going to continue our series where we get to look at the cat again. And just love that cat. I hope we can get that cat to smile by the time we're through. I'm going to close in prayer, and then I'm going to invite you to come on up if you have a question about the message today. Or if you just want to come up and introduce yourself, I'd love to meet you. Let's pray. Father, I need this, what we've looked at today. We all need what we've looked at today. And I pray that we would obey you. We would do what you tell us to do when someone does us wrong. And for the difference that will make in our lives and in the lives of others. We'll give you praise and we'll give you thanks. Amen. Thanks for coming. Hope to see you next week.